Way back in the early 30s, my grandpa used to hunt gators in the Louisiana Bayou. Grandpa and my 4 great aunts and uncles grew up hand-to-mouth in a little town called Rosedale, near the Atchafalaya River and the bayous it flowed into. Times were tough even before the Great Depression, but after Wall Street crashed, money became even harder to come by. You could try your hand at shrimping or fishing, but since most folks couldn't afford luxuries anymore, the seafood market took a huge hit. Store-cupboard staples like canned fish or oysters still moved, but the canneries only needed so many workers. And the same could be said for the logging crews, too. Construction jobs dropped off almost entirely once the Depression hit, and so did the demand for wood, which left good, honest folks like my grandpa with fewer and fewer options. There was good money to be made selling moonshine, but with Prohibition in effect till '33, it was still a risky business around the time Grandpa needed work. If the revenue men didn't get you, your rival moonshiners surely would, because there was no sure thing as a friendly competition when it came to selling moonshine. However, if you were desperate or crazy enough, there was another method of making money back then, one that would make you an awful lot too while putting food on the table at the very same time. Alligator hunting. The bayou outside of Rosedale is a tangle of cypress trees and tupelo gums, with narrow waterways running between small strips of land that folks call hammocks or house islands. There are much more open stretches of water here and there, but the gators thrive in those mosquito-infested mazes that are sometimes so dense that barely any sunlight reaches the mud and murky waters below it. And there, and if they get enough food, gators can grow from 3-foot juveniles to 12-foot monsters in just over 5 to 6 years. Then the bigger and more powerful they get, the more dangerous and deadly they become. Gator trappers had to know the terrain inside and out if they wanted to safely navigate in and out of the swamps, and a lot of folks made money that way, guiding hunters or trappers into the deepest parts of the bayou where all the oldest and biggest gators lived. You had to know where they nested, where they basked, and where they'd relocate to whenever the rains or tides came in. But if you got it right, you can make a hell of a lot of money in those days. An experienced party of hunters and trappers working dawn till dusk might bring back 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 gators. Then, with good quality gator hides selling for $3 or $4 apiece, a party of 5 could each expect to take home money and food to last their families a week, and all from just a single day's work. It wasn't just the hides that were in demand either. If you salted the gator meat, you could make it last even longer, or sell it while keeping the fresh stuff for yourself. Grandpa also said that there was a mambo, a voodoo priestess out near Mayette Point, who'd pay good money for the gator's teeth and claws for use in her black magic rituals. Given how lucrative it was, it's easy to see why gator hunting attracted so many amateurs, especially once the economy really went into freefall. But it was also very dangerous work, obviously. In that first year or so after the crash, dozens of enterprising but inexperienced young men waded off into the deepest, darkest depths of the bayou, hoping to secure a living, but finding nothing but death. Arguably, the safest way to bag yourself a gator back then was to trap one. A trapper would bait a heavy hook of iron or steel with a hunk of meat, the more rancid the better, and then simply hang it over a tree branch with a rope like they were fishing. Grandpa said that it could be a horribly effective method, but only when it worked. The gators were just as likely to lunge out of the water than tear the meat from the hook without getting impaled, and like the steel-holed leg traps that some trappers used, not everyone could afford them. Instead, most of the greener boys simply waded out into the swamps with a rifle or a shotgun and hoped for the best, but few ever returned. The same could be said for the whole crews of boys who paddled out in their pirogues in the middle of the night. They used to bring oil lanterns along with them, and when they raised them up high, they'd be able to see the telltale glow of an alligator's eyes. It must have made for an easy method of finding them, but with all that splashing around and with all that blood in the water, it was often the case that the hunter became the hunted. Stray into the wrong waters and an angry gator could snap a boat in half, or drag a man under the water and drown him before his friends even realized what was happening. Just getting bitten out there could prove fatal too, like in the case of one hunter who ended up being the lone survivor of his party. Gators tore up his boat and ate his friends, and although he managed to escape, the trapper had to wade through stinking swamp water all night long in order to make it back to his hometown. Now, folks over there were heartbroken that they'd lost loved ones, but took solace in the lone survivor having made it home. But he didn't last a week. All that nasty swamp water had soaked into the bite wound to his leg, and he quickly came down with some kind of infection. His family called in a doctor all the way from Baton Rouge, but in the days before antibiotics, there was nothing it could do. And that blight took him down in just a couple of days, and when he was buried, they lowered 3 empty coffins into the dirt right next to him, one for each of his missing friends. Now, news of any deaths out in the swamps always swept through the parish like wildfire, but not one of them stopped people heading out there to hunt gators. And it got so bad that people started making money returning the personal effects of the missing, should they happen across washed-up pirogues or abandoned camps. It was about then that the parish sheriff decided to call time on the whole situation, so he and his boys started cracking down on anyone hunting or trapping without a license. But since licenses cost $5 and could take weeks to obtain, the crackdown didn't stem the steady trickle of the desperate and the doomed. My grandpa was lucky enough to have a license, as did a handful of other Rosedale residents, and although there was sometimes fierce competition between parties, their rivals were for the most part friendly. They'd all meet up to drink, smoke, and swap stories at a place they called the Blind Tiger. And that wasn't even the name of the joint either. A lot of illegal drinking spots were named Blind Tigers back then, and all because of some joke about paying a man to see a blind tiger when, really, you were spending your money on booze. Anyway, a lot of the Rosedale trappers and hunters would meet up at this one Blind Tiger on the woods off of Hunter's Run, and they needed no incentive to get drunk and barbecue gator meat, but the real benefits of hanging around that place were the tricks and tips and lessons that you learned from other hunters. Grandpa and his hunting buddies, Charlie and Whit, used to stop by the Blind Tiger every evening, sometimes just to get the scoop on where the good hunting was that week. He said he used to hear some fine and fanciful rumors around that bar. But then, in the summer of 1931, Grandpa heard one which absolutely stole the show. There was a guy, Little John Guidry, this gator hunter who headed up a group of 4, and he was busy telling everyone in attendance about a recent trip into the deepest recesses of the Bayou Sheen. They were out looking for the biggest gators they could find when, suddenly, they saw this huge, alabaster white gator basking on a narrow house island. Their pirogues were all full up with kills for that morning, so they'd have no room for any additional quarry, but even if they had, it would have taken a heck of a lot of wrangling to get that monster into a boat. Guidry said that from teeth to tail, that albino gator had to be at least 20 feet long, meaning the beast had to be carrying around 2,000 pounds of meat and hide on its carcass. But almost as soon as he and his boys laid eyes on it, it slipped into the water and disappeared. All 3 of Guidry's hunting buddies attested to his claim, and while Grandpa might have gotten away with just calling Little John a liar, accusing his whole party would have been downright foolish. But even so, Guidry and his boys could see the disbelief on the faces of those who listened. The doubt of their fellow hunters didn't seem to bother them, though, because Guidry and his boys claimed their doubters would be laughing on the other sides of their faces once they'd hauled that albino beast back home. And because a hide that size, and in such a rare color, they'd be able to afford a whole week of easy living for the sale of it. And so off they went, night after night looking for Old Red Eyes, as they'd taken to calling it at that point. Then one morning, Little John Guidry's wife woke up to find her husband hadn't returned home. It wasn't entirely unusual for hunters to camp out overnight with their kills, especially if the tides changed or the rains came. But when the sun started to set and Little John's party still hadn't emerged from the swamps, people started to worry. Grandpa said Little John's wife barged into the bar that night and demanded to know why the other hunters and trappers weren't out there looking for her husband. The sheriff and his deputies were out there searching for him, but they didn't know the swamps even half as well as the likes of Grandpa and his buddies. Little John could be out there somewhere, gravely wounded, sheltering in the wreck of his pirogue as hungry gators circled him, and the only people in any position to help him were my grandpa and his fellow hunters. Grandpa told me that the more he thought about them, the more Mrs. Guidry's words made sense. He imagined being stuck out there, bleeding to death while the gators closed in, and how he'd be praying someone from town came looking for him. It wouldn't feel right going back into the swamps without a mind to look for Little John and his boys, even if it was just to bring home what was left of them. And so, one day, Grandpa met with Charlie and Whit at the Blind Tiger and put a proposition to them. They traveled deeper into the swamps than they ever had before to bring home some gator and maybe, just maybe, Little John Guidry along with them. Now, Grandpa and his buddies were faced with two very big challenges here. First off, heading out into the deeper parts of the swamp would require an overnight stay someplace, and it was in darkness that the hunters had the most to fear. Then secondly, they'd need the help of one or two extra hunting parties to cover all the ground they needed covering. Grandpa told Charlie and Whit to go get the supplies that they needed for this long trip into the bayou, while he went around trying to enlist the other hunting parties into joining them on the search. But just about everyone he spoke to thought he was crazy. While it was heartbreaking that Little John Guidry had gone missing, and while everyone felt sorry for his wife and kids, it was his own damn fault for heading too deep into the bayou, and all the while searching for a giant white alligator that may or may not have been something he made up. If a dozen more hunters went out there looking for him, in places that human beings did not belong, the most likely outcome was that more families would just end up wearing black. And just like Icarus, as they say, Little John flew a little too close to the sun and got his ass burned. Nobody's fault but his own. Grandpa said that he couldn't blame people for feeling that way. He even agreed with them to an extent, but there was still that voice in his head telling him he had to do something. He told me that he thought that voice was actually Jesus because he knew damned well how crazy of an idea it was, but he wanted to do it anyway. Yet as luck would have it, so did just one other hunting party. Gaston Dupree, or Gator to his friends, was one of the best hunters and trappers in the entire parish, but it was no secret that he was sweet on Little John's sister-in-law, a girl named Eulalie Badru. Grandpa said that he took some convincing, but in the end he agreed. Then after they'd all gathered up their men and materials, the 7-strong hunting party set off in their pirogues towards Bayou Sheen. Grandpa said that that first day was slow going. They had to keep their eyes peeled for any trace of Little John and his boys, and they had a 14-mile stretch of river to cover before they reached Bayou Sheen. He said it was very eerie out there that morning, the only sound being the putter of their pirogues' small engines as they glided through the water. And I know what he means too, because it all looks exactly the same today as it did back then. The water was black as oil, cypress trees stabbing up through the surface and these wailing birds sounding like wandering spirits. You might spot a half-submerged log, floating just a little too still until you realize it's no log at all, just another gator waiting patiently for its next meal. It can get very creepy out there when it's quiet and still like that, yet there was Grandpa, heading out into the bayou's deepest, darkest depths. The two hunting-turned-search parties arrived at Bayou Sheen in the early afternoon. It was around there that Little John claimed to have seen his prize gator, so both parties figured it was a good place as any to start looking. They agreed to meet back up on the main body of the Chafalaya River in the morning, but until then, they were to split up and drive the pirogues up and down the narrow channels looking for any sign of Little John, his boys, or the remains of any other poor soul who had disappeared in the previous few months. To safely navigate the much narrower waterways, Grandpa and his buddies, Charlie and Whit, switched from their engine to their oars, paddling up and down Bayou Sheen until their arms ached from it. They saw plenty of gators, swamp rats, and the occasional snapping turtle, but no sign of Little John or his hunting party. They searched all afternoon and well into the evening. Then when the light started getting low, Grandpa and his two friends began looking for a house island dry enough to camp on. They continued up and down the channels, with the bayou getting darker and darker with each passing minute, until finally, they were forced to navigate by the light of nothing but their oil lanterns and the moon. Grandpa said that sort of navigation was very dangerous, mostly because the chances of wrecking your pirogue were much higher. And if you wrecked your pirogue way out in the deep swamps, you were in major trouble, even if you were a strong swimmer. And with that in mind, they paddled very slowly with Charlie at the head of the boat, lantern in hand, guiding them through the darkness. He couldn't hold it too far over the front, though, not unless he wanted his arm bitten off by a gator, and they knew that they were surrounded by them because they could see all of those eyes reflecting the orange glow of their lanterns. Grandpa always said that was the worst part of paddling through the swamps at night, seeing everything that was looking back at you. And although I've never seen the sight myself, just thinking about it sends a chill down my spine. After a while of searching for a place to camp, Grandpa said that he and his buddies started seeing lamplights in the distance. They figured that they might have happened across the camp of Gator Dupree and his boys, but as they got close, they realized someone had built some kind of structure way out there in the swamps. They paddled closer and closer, unsure of what to expect, and then suddenly, Grandpa said he spotted a big black cross painted against a white background. It was a church, its rear on a house island, its front right up against the water, and it was deathly quiet. Grandpa and his boys pulled up to the landing, calling out to see if anyone was home, and a few seconds later, some old half-blind deacon emerged to welcome them. When they mentioned that they were looking for a place to stay, this deacon said that they were more than welcome to spend a few hours sleeping among the pews. Grandpa and his buddies thanked him, tied up their pirogue, and then piled into the tiny church to find a total of 4 pews lit by candlelight and an old rugged cross to the front. When the deacon asked them what they were doing out in the swamp so late at night, Grandpa shared the tale of Little John and their hopes of bringing him home alive. The deacon said he'd pray for the man's safe return, but when Grandpa mentioned the great white alligator Little John claimed to have seen, the deacon's expression, he says, turned cold. He told Grandpa he'd seen Old Red Eyes himself, up close too, and not only was it real, but it was the biggest damn gator he'd ever laid eyes on. He said he'd been out in his pirogue, sharing the good word with some of the swamp folk who lived out near Catahoula, and then while on his way back, he was paddling on a stretch of water when something huge and pale slipped out of the undergrowth to his rear and into the swamp. He said it was no use a thing that size trying to hide, and the almighty splash that it made as it slid into the water had him clutching at the crucifix that hung around his neck. And he started paddling like a madman, trying to get away from it, but every time he looked over his shoulder, the bubbles on the surface got closer and closer and closer. He knew the bayou well enough to know that a gator had taken a deadly disliking to him, and if it snapped his pirogue in half, he was going to have to swim like the devil to safely reach solid ground. But then, right as the thing was about to reach him, he started up with, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures, and he leadeth me beside still waters." The deacon said it seemed like the moment the words "still waters" left his lips, the bubbles stopped moving. He kept on paddling like his life depended on it, but the great white gator submerged beneath those waters, the one that had once seemed intent on making him dinner, had stopped dead in its tracks. Grandpa said his buddy, Whit Watson, told the deacon that, with all due respect, it was going to take more than prayers to bring in an animal of that size. And once again, the deacon turned white. Grandpa said the deacon lowered his voice and then told him to listen, and listen good. He then said that, sure, they were living and breathing. The devil moved among the bayou, and that he'd seen him with his own eyes, and that he moved through the beasts and the birds just the same as he did through people. He didn't know where Old Red Eyes was, nor did he know exactly what he was, but he had more chance of dragging us all down to hell than we did dragging him out of that swamp. His words didn't come off at all that kind, but the deacon meant them as a good-natured warning. An alligator that size and temperament wouldn't be brought down easy, and Grandpa was putting his life at risk just moving through its territory. But they hadn't paddled all that way just to turn around and head home, not when they were so close to the heart of the swamps. So, at dawn, once there was enough light to get going again, Grandpa and his buddies climbed back into their boat and then set off deeper into the bayou. Grandpa said it was still early in the morning and they were paddling slow while eating stale bread and molasses for breakfast when they suddenly heard a distant sound that chilled their blood. 1 minute, there was nothing but the low buzzing of bullfrogs, cicadas, and crickets coming from the underbrush, and then out of nowhere, there was the distant boom of a gunshot. It was just one at first, the kind of single large-caliber gunshot you hear when a trapped gator gets dispatched with a rifle. But then they heard 4 or 5 more pops way off in the distance, these smaller guns going off, only these sounded way more frantic, like something wasn't going to plan. Grandpa said he and his buddies started paddling like crazy in the direction of the gunshots, but soon they started to see some really big gators floating in the waters around their boat. Unlike the smaller juveniles and young adults in the outer swamps, these fully grown gators didn't much feel like moving out of the way. So rather than risk making them mad by bumping them with their boat, Grandpa and his buddies started taking things much slower, while having to pick their jaws up from the bottom of the boat at the sheer size of some of these things. He said there were some real monsters out there, the kind they'd usually have stopped and hunted before retreating out of danger. But on that occasion, they just kept paddling by, trying not to bother them, as they continued into the heart of the bayou. Grandpa said that they carried on paddling for about an hour, getting more and more nervous as they did, because if they strayed into any of the gators' spawning grounds, some overprotective mamas could cause them some real hassle. They're taking things real slow, keeping their eyes peeled and their mouths shut. Then at one point, they paddled around a wall of bald cypress trees and spotted something that almost turned their stomachs. Through a jagged clearing on the bank, they could see a campsite strewn with the blood-splattered remnants of Gator Dupree's hunting party. Grandpa said it was one of the most horrific sights that he'd ever seen. Guns and gear were scattered everywhere, and empty John boats still listed in the shadows, while half-eaten bodies lay among the sawgrass as flies buzzed over the carnage. There were limbs missing. Bodies had been ripped open with one man's boot sitting upright still laced like it had been yanked clean off, and it was the kind of mess no knife or gunshots leave behind. But if it was a gator that had made that mess, it must have been unusually big and very fast for an animal its size. Grandpa said that after seeing all those bodies, he and his boys started to discuss turning back, because if he, Charlie, and Whit went any deeper into the swamps, it might be their half-eaten bodies some horrified group of hunters would end up happening across in the future. Gator Dupree and his boys were much more experienced hunters than they were, and had traveled in larger numbers too. If they hadn't been able to best whatever had attacked them, what chance did Grandpa and his buddies have? Grandpa said that on the journey back, the weight of all that loss hung over them. They felt ashamed and defeated, but if they didn't return home, then who would provide for their families? Whit was up front paddling steadily when he suddenly pointed out a huge gator, easily 12 foot long, that was basking on a house island. Whit said that he thought it was the gator that killed Dupree and his crew. Charlie was skeptical and said just about any gator that size or bigger could have done it. Grandpa said he was about halfway through agreeing with Charlie when the murky waters in front of the 12-foot alligator suddenly exploded. Out of nowhere, the monstrous 20-foot albino gator surged up from the depths of the swamp. Pale as death, its reddish-pink eyes flashed as its jaw clamped down on the basking gator's head with this disgusting crunch. The smaller gator thrashed wildly, whipping its tail and flailing its stunted limbs, but it was no match for this humongous beast that had somehow managed to take it completely by surprise. The albino gator then dragged it back into the swamp in a swirl of foam and blood, then swam off submerged, before it was all still again. Whit's jaw was dropped as Charlie froze with the paddle mid-stroke. Grandpa said he was the same, still as a statue in the rocking boat, just staring at the ripples that thing left in its wake. Grandpa said there were a few moments of stunned silence, the boat rocking gently as the ripples slowly faded. But then suddenly, the water down the channel started to churn, and the next thing they knew, a huge blur of silt and pale hide was slicing through the swamp, coming at them so fast they barely had time to react. Grandpa paddled like the devil, while Whit fumbled with the shotgun, slamming shells into the breach, and he said he turned just as the beast erupted from the murky water, streaming off of its ghostly hide, teeth bared for the kill. As old Red Eyes surged upward, jaws gaping like an open grave, Whit fired twice. The blast echoed across the swamp as shotgun pellets tore into the albino's snout. Fresh, bright red blood streaked its scales, but the shots were only enough to daze it, and it sank beneath the surface with a hiss. Grandpa said the boat suddenly lurched forward as the beast splashed down, and for a moment he thought that they might be in the clear. But maybe a second or two later he heard the same thrashing sound in the water behind them as old Red Eyes once again prepared to charge. Grandpa said his arms were burning by the time the water exploded again, but still he and Charlie rowed like the devil, willing each other to push harder, while at the rear of the boat, Whit held the shotgun with trembling hands and began praying out loud. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," he yelled as he reloaded. "He maketh me lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leads me in the path of righteousness. And though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for he..." Grandpa said Whit's final words were drowned out by another explosion of water. That albino beast lunged, jaws snapping inches from the boat's edge, but Whit's timing was right, and his aim was true. Grandpa said he heard a deafening roar as Whit unleashed another 2 shots, only this time, the pellets ripped through old Red Eye's flesh, causing dark red blood to gush into the foam. The beast thrashed, a guttural bellow escaping its maw, and then it slumped, wounded and broken, before slinking off back into the depths. Whit rushed to reload the shotgun as Grandpa and Charlie kept paddling, but except for the creak of the boat, the splashing of the oars and their ragged breaths, the bayou soon fell silent again. The boat glided through the swamp, their paddle strokes slow and heavy as they reached the next bayou, which would take them home again. Grandpa said he remembered how Whit sat up front, shotgun still across his lap, with a look of exhaustion and guilt across his face. He said that expression captured the mood. No bodies recovered, no closure to carry home, and they'd been lucky to escape with their lives. That sense of defeat made the journey back feel endless. They spoke little, their silence louder than words, dreading the shame of returning empty-handed to families who hoped for miracles. And the sun was setting by the time they reached the dock near where Rama stands today, and Grandpa and his buddies climbed out, legs very unsteady, and then they left their boat tied up as they walked on into town. First came the reunion, with parents, siblings, and kin of all kinds rushing forward. Whit's ma threw her arms around him, not caring that her boy smelled like sweat and swamp rot, while Charlie's baby sister clung to his leg and his pa praising Jesus for a safe return. And Grandpa remembered all of this, as well as his mother telling him how proud she was. It didn't matter that they'd return empty-handed. They tried, and that's what counted. Second came the bad news, delivered personally to the families of Gator Dupree and his boys. Gator's mama collapsed with a wail when Grandpa broke the news that her boy wasn't coming home, and that she would have taken a nasty tumble if she wasn't caught by Gator's 2 sisters. The same went for the families of his hunting party. The kin had gone out to rescue Little John and save his kinfolk from the agony of his loss. But in a horrible twist of fate, they too were now condemned to wear black. To Grandpa, It all seemed like some kind of sick cosmic joke, and he couldn't help but feel like he was the punchline. Why shouldn't he survive when so many hadn't? And how could he live with himself knowing that he'd turn tail and run at the first sign of trouble? He said he struggled with thoughts like that for a long time, until the day of Little John's funeral when his grieving widow told Grandpa how much she appreciated his efforts to recover her husband's body. Grandpa said that helped him deal with most of the guilt he felt, but not all of it, and he ended his gator hunting days for good after the encounter with old Red Eyes. He traded the Bayou for a cornfield, ended up catching the eye of that Boudreaux girl that I mentioned earlier. Then, after a long courtship, they were married under the cypress trees during the spring of 41. And sadly, the draft snatched him up in 42, and after storming through the liberation of France and helping free villages from Normandy to the Rhine, he returned to his beloved home and started a family. And years later, Grandpa would sit us by the fire in a low voice and tell us this exact story of his encounter with old Red Eyes. But whenever he did, he'd swear to us kids that no battle ever chilled his blood like the day he and his boys stared into the crimson glare of the monstrous albino alligator who almost dragged them all to hell. In January of 1999, two brothers from South Florida, James and David Adams, ventured into the Big Cypress Swamp for what they expected to be a routine hunting trip. The Big Cypress, a sprawling wilderness of cypress strands, sawgrass marshes, and pine flatwoods, was familiar territory for the pair. So armed with rifles and riding an ATV, they drove out deep into the swamps to hunt deer and small game. But what began as a simple day trip spiraled into a 6-day nightmare that tested the limits of both their endurance and their sanity. Things started to go wrong when their ATV broke down deep in the swamp, miles from any dirt road or highway. To their horror, the usually reliable vehicle's engine suddenly sputtered out, leaving them stranded amid a labyrinth network of muddy waterways and dense vegetation. Back in the late 90s, cell phone reception in such remote areas was spotty at best, meaning it was impossible for the brothers to summon assistance. So instead of waiting around and hoping someone stumbled across them by chance, the Adams brothers decided to abandon the ATV and trek back on foot. They later said they assumed they could navigate using the sun, as well as their hard-worn instincts as seasoned outdoorsmen. But the swamp had other plans. In the days prior, heavy rains had swollen the swamp's waterways. Rising water levels erased familiar landmarks and turned even the driest patches of ground into quagmires of knee-deep sludge. The brothers tried their best to maintain both course and composure, but each soon realized that they were hopelessly lost. As dusk fell, the temperature plummeted, and in a rare cold snap for the usually balmy South Florida, that night's temperatures dipped into the 40s. Wearing only light hunting gear, James and David had no jackets or blankets to keep themselves warm, and instead huddled together under a cypress tree, shivering as the damp air seemed to seep into their bones. When darkness arrived, the swamp came alive with unsettling sounds. The brothers heard the guttural bellows of alligators, the rustle of skittering swamp rats, and the constant drip of the ever-rising water. James later recalled hearing a loud splash nearby. Convinced it was a gator sizing them up, he grabbed his rifle and tried to remain calm. But every snap of a twig sent spasms of fear through the brothers' guts as their minds raced with thoughts of what lurked in the dark. On the second day, hunger and thirst set in. The two brothers quickly ran out of what little food and water they'd brought along and, in desperation, resorted to sipping from pools of stagnant brown swamp water. They gagged at the taste of rotten decay, but knowing dehydration would kill them far quicker than any germ or parasite, they drank it all the same. As they walked, their boots grew heavy with mud and their legs ached from wading through the mire. Mosquitoes swarmed relentlessly, leaving welts on their exposed skin as they tried and failed to swat them away. At one point, David, the younger of the two brothers, started to exhibit signs of severe fatigue. James urged him on, but he too was beginning to falter. They needed a route out of the swamp, and they needed it soon. And on the third day, James and David stumbled across an old hunter's camp. It was little more than a rotting wooden platform half submerged in the water, and there were no supplies to be scavenged. But since it offered a brief respite from the endless sea of mud and slime, the two brothers decided to rest a while. They tried to start a fire with soggy twigs and a lighter James carried with him, but the damp wood refused to catch. They endured, but as darkness fell, so did the rains. That night, a storm rolled in, soaking them to the core and flooding their makeshift shelter. The rising water forced them back into the swamp, where they clung to tree roots to avoid being swept away. James later said that he thought they'd drown right there, swallowed by the swamp, and began doubting if they'd ever get out alive. On day 4, exhaustion and hypothermia began taking a brutal toll. The brothers' pace slowed to a crawl, with each step becoming a battle against both the sucking mud and their own failing bodies. David's lips turned blue, and he began mumbling incoherently as signs of delirium set in. His brother, terrified of losing him in the vastness of the swamp, tied their belts together in order to keep him close. They'd stopped talking about rescue. Survival was now about enduring from one hour to the next. And that night, they heard a helicopter in the distance. It was part of a search effort launched by their family after they failed to return. But to the brothers' horror and frustration, the swamp's canopy was too thick for the chopper to see them, and the sound faded away. Day 5 brought a dim flicker of hope. The brothers found a patch of higher and thus drier ground. Then, with trembling hands, they managed to spark a small fire using some grass and the last of James's lighter fluid. The smoke was thin, but they took turns feeding the fire, praying that it would be enough to draw the attention of search and rescue teams, because their time was running out. The brothers' bodies were breaking down. James's feet were raw from trench foot, and David was so weak he could barely stand. Both were gaunt, their faces hollowed out by hunger, and as the swamp began to sense their weakness, its wildlife grew bolder. James said at one point he spotted the eyes of what he could only assume was an alligator, reflecting the glow of their firelight. He aimed his rifle, readying himself for the beast to attack, but fortunately, it did not approach. On the morning of the 6th day, January 14th of 1999, a rescue helicopter finally spotted the brothers' faint smoke signal. The pilot, part of a coordinated search involving swamp buggies, airboats, and dozens of volunteers, hovered over the clearing as James waved weakly with tears of joy and relief streaming down his face. Ropes were dropped before medics hoisted the brothers aboard. They were skeletal, dehydrated and hypothermic, their core temperatures having dropped dangerously low. Paramedics wrapped them in blankets, using IVs to pump fluids into their veins as they were rushed to a hospital in nearby Naples. It was there that doctors marveled at their tale of survival. 6 days with no food, with only tainted water to drink, not to mention exposure to the elements in a swamp teeming with predators. All in all, it was nothing short of a miracle that the Addams brothers were still alive. James and David recovered physically, though the mental scars lingered. James later told reporters, "I thought we were gator food. Every night I heard them out there, waiting." Their story became a local legend, a testament to human resilience and a stark reminder of the Big Cypress Swamp's unforgiving nature. And for those 6 days, it wasn't just a landscape. It was a living, breathing adversary that almost claimed their lives. Tucked within the low-lying coastal plains of southeastern Virginia, the Great Dismal Swamp is a living labyrinth of towering, bald trees emerging from murky, muddy pools. In ancient times, the peat-rich forests that surround the swamp were the favorite hunting grounds of the native Chesapeake and Nansemond tribes, who stalked deer, wild turkey, and feral hogs through black gum trees that turned a bright orange-pink in the fall. While more recently, the swamp served as a refuge for those escaping a life of slavery in the antebellum South. These days, The Great Dismal Swamp has been designated a national wildlife refuge, with contemporary conservation efforts ensuring a boom in the populations of black bears, bobcats, and otters, along with its 70 species of reptiles and amphibians, and its 213 varieties of birds. The swamp is even home to a few alligators, vagrants who swim up the Pasquotank River from the wetlands of North Carolina. But in the late 1980s, it played host to one of the most chilling criminal events of the decade. Thomas Lee Bonney was born and raised in Chesapeake, Virginia, and as a young man he established an auto salvage yard, which he grew into a very successful business. He married a woman named Dorothy May in the late 1960s. Then, in August of 1968, they welcomed the first of 6 children into the world, a girl named Kathy Carol Bonney. Thomas loved his daughter dearly, but Dorothy May soon noticed a certain overprotectiveness in her husband. He was both a religious and reasonable man, meaning his wife felt perfectly comfortable in confronting such behavior. But when she raised the issue, Thomas made a heart-rending confession. Although he didn't go into too much detail, Thomas explained that he'd grown up in the shadow of a deeply abusive father. He was neglected for long periods of time, and whenever his father was around, he'd subject his young son to severe physical abuse for even the most minor of infractions. Thomas told Dorothy May that he loved and despised his father with equal measure, and that he was terrified of making the same terrible mistakes. His wife assured him that together they'd ensure that didn't happen, but Thomas never quite rid himself of his overprotective instincts. Despite Thomas Bonney's overbearing supervision, or perhaps as a result of it, his daughter's teenage years were characterized by a growing spirit of rebelliousness. When he emphasized the importance of her education, she responded by dropping out of high school. Then, after he tried to enforce a so-called no-dating rule, a 19-year-old Kathy began an illicit affair with a married man more than 20 years her senior. Concerned by his daughter's behavior, Thomas searched her bedroom for signs of anything troubling, and in a desk drawer, he found a letter written by her much older paramour. It's believed this letter contained extremely graphic descriptions of illicit acts, and upon reading it, Thomas became incensed. He explained to Kathy that dating such a venally deranged individual wasn't safe, and that extramarital affairs either ended with heartbreak at best or violence at worst. Yet to his horror, his daughter refused to listen. Thomas was faced with every father's worst nightmare. He loved his daughter dearly, but her increasingly reckless behavior was putting her at risk in ways that was impossible for him to explain. Then, in late fall of 1987, Thomas Bonney's deepest and most primal fears became reality. On the morning of November 22nd, Thomas contacted the Chesapeake Police Department to file a missing persons report. He told them that the previous evening he'd driven his daughter to a nearby 7-Eleven to meet a man named John. According to Kathy, John wanted to sell his old Chevy Blazer, which, due to its age and heavy mileage, was being offered at a very reasonable price. Naturally, she wanted to give the SUV a test drive before handing over the cash and had agreed to meet its owner at the 7-Eleven parking lot at around 9 p.m. Thomas agreed to give Kathy a ride, but only if he could observe the meeting to ensure that it wasn't dating-related. His daughter seemed only too happy to let him witness the exchange, so off they went. Thomas then recalled how upon arriving at the 7-Eleven parking lot, he witnessed his daughter's meeting with the Chevy's owner, John. Kathy climbed into the SUV's driver's seat, took it for a spin around the parking lot, then handed over the cash once she was happy with its performance. Thomas said that he congratulated his daughter on the successful purchase of her first car. Then, in her excitement, she asked if she could take it for a spin before meeting him back home. Realizing that stifling one of his daughter's first major milestones would be stupid, the usually overprotective Thomas agreed to the proposal, but not without a warning to be home before midnight. Kathy agreed and climbed into the driver's seat of her brand new Chevy, and then drove off with a toot of her horn. But upon waking up the following morning, Thomas discovered that neither his daughter nor her new car were anywhere to be found. Police told Thomas his fatherly concern was understandable, but in the eyes of the law, Kathy was an adult who was free to do as she pleased. Under the circumstances, a missing persons report could be filed after 24 hours without contact. Thomas tried waiting until the 9 p.m. deadline, but was so gripped with terror over his daughter's well-being that he called back just prior to 7 to express his anxiety. Then, and only then, was an officer dispatched to the Bonney family home. Upon the arrival of law enforcement, Thomas repeated his account of giving Kathy a ride to purchase the SUV. He believed that John, the vehicle's apparent owner, might somehow be involved in his daughter's disappearance, but given her newfound mobility, she could have driven just about anywhere before getting herself into trouble. Thomas also mentioned the extramarital affair Kathy had been conducting and how he believed the man in question was a dangerous deviant. Then, after sharing as much pertinent information as possible, the officer thanked Thomas for his time and then departed his residence. For Kathy's friend and family, the night of November 21st was a sleepless one. While many feared that driving at night on deserted Virginia highways had resulted in some kind of road accident, others suspected Kathy's recklessness had finally bore a terrible fruit. Yet the reality was much more horrifying. The following afternoon, a local hunter named James Sawyer was trudging along a heavily wooded area near the Great Dismal Swamp Canal when he made a deeply alarming discovery. A pair of blood-stained underwear was sitting near the water's edge, and just a few feet away, the naked body of an adult female was lying in a disturbingly unnatural position. Her torso was riddled with gunshot wounds, and she'd been so badly beaten that she could only be identified via fingerprints. Then and only then did police realize that the victim in question was the missing 19-year-old Kathy Bonney. A subsequent search of the teenager's bedroom revealed a half-finished letter to her married paramour, the contents of which had never been made public, along with some adult magazines and a pair of handcuffs. Thomas was devastated. He had long suspected that his daughter's older lover was priming her for deviancy, and the discovery of the handcuffs seemed only to confirm his worst fears. In light of that, his cooperation with detectives was enthusiastic to say the least, with Thomas giving hours upon hours of recorded interviews in the hopes that some minor detail would force a break in the case. Yet the more he talked, the more certain inconsistencies in his story became apparent. The first thing that aroused the detective's suspicion was the casual change of detail in Thomas's story. For weeks, he claimed to have driven his daughter to the test drive in his wrecker. Then one day, he suddenly claimed to have used a Chevrolet. Thomas also told detectives that in the weeks before his daughter's murder, he'd sold his 9-shot .22 revolver for $100. But when police asked the name of the person he'd sold it to, Thomas claimed that he couldn't remember. Detectives then spoke to Thomas's business partner, whom he operated the salvage yard with. In his experience, Thomas was an honest, hardworking, and deeply conscientious person, a man who made doing business with him a pleasure. But over the previous few weeks, he'd started noticing something strange. One day, Tom's partner approached him with a solution to an ongoing problem they'd been experiencing. He explained the situation, then laid out the proposed solution in as simple a manner as possible. Yet to his surprise, Thomas Bonney didn't seem to know what he was talking about. He remained quiet, maintained a confused, almost bewildered look about him. Then when his partner asked if he understood, Thomas replied with a nervous-sounding, "Yes, sir." Firstly, Thomas never, ever called his partner sir. The two weren't exactly close friends, but they'd been working together long enough to have developed a casual but trusting relationship. The most formal Thomas ever got was calling his partner by his first name, so where had the sir suddenly come from? Later that day, Thomas's business partner reapproached him regarding his potential solution just to make sure all had been understood. Thomas seemed to have returned to his composed and confident self, but to his partner's confusion, he claimed to have no recollection of the discussion regarding their problem. Assuming Thomas had been preoccupied and had not fully listened, his partner re-explained his proposal. Thomas understood perfectly, gave him the go-ahead, then concluded the discussion amicably. His partner was pleased, yet remained so unsettled regarding Thomas's apparent memory loss that it was one of the first things he mentioned when questioned by police. Detectives soon turned to Kathy's siblings for answers, and in December of '87, they spoke to her younger sister. Susan Bonney claimed that despite his wholesome veneer, her paranoid control freak of a father was feared by all his children, but none more so than she. You see, it was her that had seen bloodstains in her father's Chevy on the same night Kathy was thought to have disappeared. It was her that pretended not to see them, and it was her that prayed her father remained ignorant of her discovery. Not wishing to raise suspicion, detectives found a way of casually asking about the Chevy's whereabouts when Thomas told them he'd sold it in the days following his daughter's disappearance. They rushed to track it down, and in doing so, a terrible truth began to emerge. After seizing Thomas Bonney's Chevy from its new owner, forensic investigators conducted a thorough analysis of the suspect vehicle. They located the bloodstains Susan had referred to, along with long strands of hair in the vehicle's trunk, and then quickly determined both belonged to Kathy. It's not clear how Thomas Bonney got wind of the investigation's sudden shift, but on December 11th of 1987, he fled Chesapeake in the middle of the night. Dorothy May was so alarmed by some of the things her husband said and did as he packed up his car that she reported herself to the police that same day, claiming she couldn't protect herself or her children from a man she no longer recognized. The manhunt lasted 2 months. Then, on January 31st of 1988, Thomas Bonney was arrested in Indiana. Once back in Virginia and having been detained on suspicion of his daughter's disappearance, Thomas was interviewed extensively by psychologist Dr. Paul Dell. Using hypnotherapy, Dr. Dell was able to identify 10 separate personalities contained within Bonney's mind, leading the doctor to conclude that Thomas was one of the most profoundly deranged individuals he'd ever come across. Along with Tom, the so-called host personality, Dell identified personas named Satan, Mammy, Demian, Viking, Tommy, Hitman, Preacher, Dad, and finally, Kathy. These personas had been created by Thomas's psyche, with each serving as a conduit by which he could process the horrific abuses of his childhood, which were apparently far, far worse than anyone had been led to believe. Dr. Dell conducted extensive interviews with many of Thomas's split personalities, including one in which he claimed Kathy was still alive and visited him in his cell every night once the guards turned out the lights. Dr. Dell conducted extensive interviews with many of Thomas's split personalities, including one in which he claimed Kathy was still alive and visited him in his cell every night once the guards turned out the lights. In Dr. Dell's opinion, such prolonged interactions left him in no doubt whatsoever that Thomas was suffering from an acutely severe case of dissociative identity disorder, along with post-traumatic stress disorder and mixed personality disorder. Dr. Dell also claimed Thomas had extensively expanded on his childhood traumas, how his father had subjected him to unthinkable levels of emotional and physical torture, and that his issues surrounding control stemmed from the sudden and unexpected death of his grandmother when he was just 10 years old. However, at Thomas's trial, a prosecution-appointed psychiatrist contested Dell's diagnosis. Dr. Philip Coons had not interviewed Thomas personally, nor did he posit any official diagnoses. But after reviewing a whopping 13 hours of Dell's footage, he realized the doctor had almost completely failed to maintain proper standards of care. Not only was Dr. Dell's line of questioning unbefitting of a psychiatric interview, but he had allowed Bonney to ramble, asked him suggestive and leading questions, and had improperly suggested to Bonney that he might have other personalities while the patient was under hypnosis. What's more, Dr. Coons argued that the death of a family member was insufficient to induce a dissociative identity disorder, then made the shocking claim that Thomas's symptoms might have actually been created by Dr. Dell's hypnosis. Dr. Coons' testimony was somewhat backed up by a physician who interacted with Thomas Bonney during treatment in October of 1988. This physician argued Thomas was indeed displaying symptoms consistent with Dr. Dell's diagnosis, but disagreed with the idea that Thomas had somehow blacked out while murdering Kathy, or was otherwise unaware of the severity of his acts. In summation, the prosecution's argument was as follows. On the night of Kathy's murder, it had in fact been Thomas Bonney's idea to go check out an SUV that was for sale, but the entire story had been nothing but a fabrication. It's clear the pair stopped by the 7-Eleven that Thomas spoke of, as Susan Bonney actually witnessed her father's vehicle pulling out of the lot. However, instead of taking Kathy to view a car, he drove her south towards the North Carolina state line, where a violent argument ensued. Thomas confronted his daughter regarding the extramarital affair that she was conducting. Then, when he was told to mind his own business, he pulled over, dragged her out of the car, then shot her to death at the side of the road. Then, to make it look as if she'd been killed by a lover, Thomas Bonney stripped Kathy of her bloodied clothes, made sure to leave her underwear clearly visible to anyone who might discover her, then beat his own daughter's face to a bloody pulp to give the impression her murder was a crime of passion. Bonney's defense team announced that they agreed with almost half the prosecution's version of events. However, in their opinion, it had been Kathy who, in the heat of the moment, had reached for the firearm she knew her father kept in his glove compartment. The defense then argued that during the ensuing struggle for Thomas's firearm, it accidentally discharged, and this is when the persona known as Demian took hold. To Demian, Kathy was not his child, merely a threat to be eliminated. Demian had been created to protect Thomas Bonney. It was the persona's one and only purpose, and protect him it did. 2 hours after murdering his own daughter, Tom returned home, and possibly owing to the condition diagnosed by Dr. Bell, he was able to look his wife dead in the eyes and ask with all sincerity, "Where's Kathy?" Bonney's defense team made a compelling argument, but the jury disagreed, and following a 7-week trial, they pronounced him guilty on November 25th of 1988. Bonney appealed his life sentence, but the North Carolina Supreme Court upheld his conviction in June of 1991. On July 29th of 1994, at around 8:30 in the morning, Bonney and a fellow inmate escaped from Central Prison through a trash compacting chute and hid in a garbage truck. While it was initially speculated that both had been crushed to death in a trash compactor during their escape attempt, the two men had stolen a car and driven to Hampton Beach. Thankfully, Bonney was captured by police 4 days later and offered no resistance. He explained the escape had been a spontaneous idea, and that his main motivation had been to visit the grave of his late mother, whose funeral he was unable to attend. He also said he wished to visit the grave of his daughter, Kathy, in order to offer an apology for his ultimate and unforgivable failure to protect her from himself. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and remember, speak to the cheeks.